Welcome to Next Economy Now. I'm your host, Andrew Baskin. The goal of this interview series is to highlight the leaders who are taking a regenerative, bioregional, democratic, diverse, transparent, and whole systems approach to using business as a force for good. In this episode of Next Economy Now, Ryan Honeyman, a partner at Lift Economy, interviews Gopal, Dayaneni, and Michelle Mascarenhas Swan. Michelle is co-director of Movement Generation Justice and Ecology Project. Since 2007, Movement Generation has been bridging the gap between our current social movement strategies and the scale of the unfolding ecological crisis. As a collective member, Michelle leads trainings, facilitates strategy sessions, and works with other groups to foster a just transition to local living economies. Michelle brings over a decade of experience pairing resilience and resistance in fostering a just food system as the founding director of the Center for Food and Justice and a Kellogg Food and Society Policy Fellow. She organized community groups in South Los Angeles and family farmers from across California to forge model programs and policy campaigns to shift power in the food system. She was one of the early initiators of the farm-to-school movement in the U.S. Under her leadership, the Center for Food and Justice organized high school students, parents, and cafeteria workers in a campaign for healthy school food in the Los Angeles Unified School District. After moving to the San Francisco Bay Area, Michelle served as co-director of the School of Unity and Liberation from 2005 to 2008 before joining Movement Generation. She has a master's in urban planning from UCLA and grew up in Southern California. Michelle is now setting roots in Berkeley, where she gardens with the extended Movement Generation family and her two lively daughters. Gopal has been involved in fighting for social, economic, environmental, and racial justice through organizing and campaigning, teaching, writing, speaking, and direct action since the late 1980s. Gopal is an active trainer with and serves on the boards of the Ruckus Society and the Center for Story-Based Strategy, formerly SmartMeme. He also serves on the advisory boards of the International Accountability Project and Catalyst Project. Gopal works at the intersection of ecology, economy, and empire. Gopal has been a campaigner for Silicon Valley Toxics Coalition on human rights and environmental justice in the high-tech industry and the oil campaigner for Project Underground, a human rights and environmental rights organization which supported communities resisting oil and mining exploitation around the world. Gopal has been active in many people-powered direct action movements, including the Global Justice Anti-Globalization Movement, Direct Action to Stop the War, Mobilization for Climate Justice, Take Back the Land, and Occupy. Gopal is the father of two young direct action junkies and lives in an intentional community with 9 adults, 8 kids, and a bunch of chickens. So without further ado, please enjoy Ryan Honeyman's conversation with Michelle Mascarenhas Swan and Gopal Dayaneni.
Gopal and Michelle, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Ryan.
Thank you for having us.
Michelle, why don't we start with you? Could you tell us a little bit about your background and when you first got interested in the type of work you're doing today?
Sure. So I grew up in Southern California, daughter of working class, white collar workers who were immigrants, and during college became aware of, first the build up to the first Gulf War that the U.S. Invaded Iraq, and then also the rise of immigrant workers in the labor movement in LA. And both of those things really galvanized me around, the need to transform this economy and this political system. And then I got interested in farming and food systems, and all of that sort of began to come together in how do we develop solutions and kind of models for food sovereignty and food justice in ways that would not just run in parallel to this economy, which just continues to destroy the land and break families apart, but would actually challenge that system and be able to transform it. So that's kind of what brought me to MG after many decades of different forms of work.
Great. And Gopal, maybe the same question for you. What brought you to this type of work, and what were you doing before?
Yeah, I have in some ways a similar journey to Michelle. I come from a family of farmers in South India, but through the Green Revolution and the cash crops and chemicals, my parents were sort of extracted from the peasant life. And my father got an education, my mother as well later, and that brought them to the West. So I grew up here in California in the Bay Area and got politicized, similarly to Michelle, around the first Gulf War and the early 90s and late 80s during the anti-apartheid movements, which sort of got me to sort of see how a lot of things that we think of as separate issues are really deeply interconnected. I remember very much developing an environmental or ecological consciousness during that first Gulf War. It was the first time I'd ever heard the expression "no blood for oil" was in 1990, and you know, the reality sort of hit me, and I think a lot of folks, that we can chant "no blood for oil" all we want, but the reality is that where there's oil, there has to be bloodshed, and the relationship between resource extraction and human exploitation are inextricable and have to be tackled together. So that sent me on that journey, and movement generation was sort of the culmination for those of us who were part of the founding of the Justice and Ecology Project. It was the opportunity to bridge our passion and commitment for racial, economic, social justice issues with a recognition that that ecology and the wisdom of living systems needs to be what's guiding our movements, and all of those things need to come together in a holistic way.
And Gopal, what year did movement generation start? And can you give folks sort of a little intro to it who maybe don't know what movement generation is?
Yeah, Movement Generation Justice and Ecology Project started about 10, 11 years ago, 2007. But actually, Movement Generation as an organization existed for a few years prior to that. Michelle actually was very involved in that process. And it was originally a study and strategy space for movement leaders and actors and organizers from our generation, basically, and a little bit younger. And then after Katrina, Hurricane Katrina happened, there was a desire to take some time to reflect on the climate crisis as it relates to racial, economic, and social justice organizing, and particularly in the urban context. And that's what sparked a set of conversations with a group of folks, including myself and Michelle and Mateo, Nube, and Carla Perez, among others. And that's what led us to say, this is the work that needs to happen at this time. And so that's sort of how we got started. Michelle, do you want to add a little more to that?
Yeah, I mean, just to say, yeah, it was a really critical moment, I think, in which a lot of us who were coming out of tenant rights organizing or immigrant rights or environmental justice or, you know, a range of different movements were realizing that, you know, as Naomi Klein has now titled her book, this changes everything, you know. And so our project was really about Movement Generation Justice and Ecology Project was really about supporting those organizers in developing an ecological lens on our movement strategies, because of the reality that we weren't yet equipped to be able to respond adequately in these moments of shocks and slides like Katrina was, if we didn't understand the crisis in its full dimensions, you know, which at that time, I think our movements were not fully equipped. You know, for the most part, we weren't well equipped to really understand how the living world underpins this economy, which, you know, we knew the economy needed to be changed and transformed, but really understanding how living systems function and how that impacts our understanding of what change looks like. That was what the project, that is what Movement Generation's work has been about for the last almost 11 years now. Yeah.
And Michelle, it may be self-evident, but is the term movement it feels like that's maybe a different term than maybe like our parents used back in the is like what is the term movement and maybe movement generation? What does that really mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, when we say movement, we're talking about, people power, really. It's about folks coming together in collective action. And specifically, we would say, the engine of building the kind of power that we need is grassroots, community-based, and workplace organizing, where folks are not just waiting for people to sort of wake up and join a listserv or something, but actually face-to-face conversations about what people are facing in their daily lives and what their stories are, and then really working together to turn those stories into also what would support a more, like humane form of life and for each of us, and how can we work together to create that. So both to like fight the things that are harming our communities, our families, the places that we depend on, but also what's our vision for what we need to build in its place.
I love that. And so maybe for Gopal, what are some of the initiatives that Movement Generation's working on? And maybe if you could speak to like, what are you most excited about within those? Like, is there any particular initiative that you are particularly energized by in the current moment?
Yeah. Well, so Movement Generation, since we've started, we've been one of the sort of, I don't know, you could call it our flagship program, has been that we do these justice and ecology retreats where we take organizers from diverse movement sectors, and in our effort to both propagate a sort of ecological understanding, but also talk about the interconnectedness of all the issues and de-siloize our work. We do these sort of 5-6 day justice and ecology retreats, and that's something that we're very well known for. And it also is in many ways the energy behind the development of and the transformation of our politics and our frames. One of the things that's interesting about us since we started is we had this idea that we all come from actually very diverse political traditions, but we came together saying, let's set aside ideology and ask ourselves the question, what does the earth demand of us right now, and what is needed by our movements at this time? And in that process have tried to develop a politic that speaks to our time, that's built on our histories and our ancestries, but that helps us move forward in a good way. There's several programs that we do that I think are really kind of highlight both the dispersed nature of our work, but also how it all ties together. One of our projects is Climate Workers, which is supporting the membership-led grassroots bottom-up intervention from organized labor and workers around climate justice and ecological justice. So we work to build the capacity of workers and worker organizing to integrate in ecological thinking, as well as a recognition of the relationship between climate disruption and worker exploitation, and also to craft solutions for what people can and should be applying their labor towards. We also have an Earth Skills program that works with, that provides trainings on everything from composting toilets and rainwater harvesting to how to occupy a house and change the locks for direct action resilience, which we consider an Earth skill. We are co-founders of the Climate Justice Alliance, in which dozens of grassroots organizations and movement support organizations are working together to create a new center of gravity in the climate discourse and climate movement. We've been instrumental in helping bring together a new work around just transition finance, and what does it mean for us to build a commons of capital? If we believe that people have the right to the resources required to create productive, dignified, and ecologically sustainable livelihoods in their communities, then the resources needed to do that belong in the commons, and capital is one of those resources. So we're working with partners around the country to build local revolving loan funds that essentially act as seed libraries of capital. We are very proud of and humbled to have been a part of the Black Land and Liberation Initiative, along with our comrades at the Blackout Collective, supporting Black organizers around the country in connecting access and right to land, to Black liberation, to ecology, and to deep economic democracy. So trying to, and from a framework of reparations. So it's just, and actually there's more. It's like this bizarre thing of like, we do a lot of different things. We also have a culture shift program that last year we put out season 1 of a web comedy show called The North Pole that connects climate change, corporate false solutions, and gentrification in North Oakland. Funny thing is we're kind of 8 people, of which only a few of us work full time, but we just have managed to move a fair bit of work. And the last thing I'll just say on the, like, what are you most proud of? In some ways, we've building on the history of the labor and environmental justice movement, work around this notion of just transition. What does it mean to transition out of extractive industries and create a pathway for workers into jobs that don't destroy the planet and that are healthy for communities? This notion of just transition, we've been very active in helping develop into a broader framework to think not simply about how we transition workers from a particular facility or a particular industry, but what does it mean to transition whole communities? And what does it mean to do it in a way in which people are exercising rights, particularly new economic rights and rights of Mother Earth, and how they do that, and have developed a set of frameworks and strategies and interventions that I think have actually, along with a whole bunch of other folks we've been working with, has had a real impact in the social movements in the United States, and particularly around environmental justice, climate justice, and new economy.
Yeah, Michelle, I'd love to hear the same question around, like, if any of those, if you want to add anything to the sort of different projects, and in particular, what you're most excited about, if anything stands out to you.
Yeah, I mean, I totally echo the things that Gopal named and said, and would just add, one of the things that I'm proud of that we have been engaged in is, like, we're looking at, like, where are the gaps in our social movement where we haven't yet figured out how to address the scale and pace of this crisis that is the economy. And so one of the ways that we've done that is by, I think these sort of shared framing and strategy spaces have been one important part of that. But the other is, like, actually building some vehicles where folks can come together from communities across place, across this continent, and ideally, also with folks in the global South and other social movements around the world, to bridge our stories and the way we understand this moment and where we're heading, to kind of come to some shared vision of that place of where we're heading, and then also to forge common strategies. So, like Gopal was naming the finance piece, that has come from communities on the ground everywhere, from Kentucky to Richmond to Detroit to Baltimore to New York to Argentina, and so on, who have been oftentimes, capital comes in and imposes, here's an industry that we want folks to come work in, and then when that line of industry dries up for whatever economic forces, cause that, the community is left high and dry, right? As we know in Detroit. So, like, and, as that economy is working well, like, it's still polluting the waters, as we've seen in Flint and other places. It's causing cancer that will go on for generations. It's, harming people's bodies on a daily basis and their families. And so folks begin to understand, right, that we need to really transform this economy in very structural ways, and we can't do it alone. So coming together across place to identify what are those leverage points that we have in common, and how can we build some infrastructure together that can replace and actually exert pressure on and oppose and stop this extractive system. I think that's been a really important part of the work that we've been doing, is identifying those gaps and in some cases helping to build the infrastructure to bridge them. So the Climate Justice Alliance, I think, is one critical space that we've been honored to be a part of, along with many, many, many other organizations who founded that body to be able to create this kind of a translocal infrastructure. And through that, communities are coming together around the Our Power campaign, and really trying to build out the transformation of economy through like shifting from a globalized food system that contributes 33% of, like a third of greenhouse gas emissions globally, to local, like regional food systems that are controlled by the folks who depend on that land, for instance, and then from landfills and incinerators to zero waste, from dirty and destructive and extractive energy systems to clean community controlled power, and so on. So I think those are the really exciting places where communities are coming together to identify, like, what are the spaces, what are the sectors of the economy that we can begin to transform with our vision for those in the long term, and then how can we come together with other communities that are also engaged in transforming those systems, right, across place, so that we can be learning from each other and leveraging our power collectively.
I love that. And I'm not sure if the two of you knew, but we have the Lift Economy team in partnership with Community Ventures, which is a nonprofit. We have a fund called the Force for Good Fund that's actually going to be a part of the financial cooperative. And so excited to be part of that with the two of you.
Yeah, that's great.
And one question, maybe to make it relevant, maybe a relevant question for our listeners might be, say I'm an entrepreneur or an impact investor, and I'm really excited by this idea, that you're speaking of, rooting it in community, considering frontline communities, considering place-based investment, non-extractive. Do you have any sort of, how do you think about what makes an investment, quote unquote, non-extractive or not? Do you have any sort of frameworks or thoughts that could help listeners think about, when they're either starting their business or, thinking about making investments, that they can keep in mind when they're thinking about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the first thing is, you're probably not going to come up with a decent definition of non-extractive if you start from the perspective of the investor. So let's just be clear about that, that how we define an investment being non-extractive is in relationship to the people impacted by the investment, not because of its relationship, not because of how the investor sort of feels about the investment. And in fact, part of the problematics of investment is the current owners of capital and those who have concentrated control of capital, either in the sort of mini enclosures of personal investment or the grand enclosures of the markets, dictate the terms by which investment happens. And so I think the underlying assumption about non-extractive finance is that we are flipping the script and turning the tables on who is actually in control of how these decisions get made. So I think from a pragmatic standpoint, there's a few key principles here. The first principle is debt is subordinate. So, debt's been around for a long time, and it hasn't always been a mechanism by which to concentrate, control, and enclose capital and wealth, to extract and enclose wealth. Debt, historically, and in its origins, was a relationship between relative equals. And in fact, the vast majority of rules around debt were designed to protect the indebted. And now in the modern era, that has flipped completely, where all the rules around debt are designed to enrich those who own the debt in the first place, rather than protect those who owe a debt. So the subordination of debt is the idea that the debt, that the risk rests with the lender, not with the borrower, quote unquote, just to use conventional terms, because what we're really trying to do with non-extractive lending is redistribute resources and repair historically extractive relationships. So the first principle is just subordination of debt. And the way that plays out practically is debt is only paid back through sharing of the surplus as projects are successful. The second really important principle is that debt should not be used to create further enclosures of wealth. So the way that we administer loans, if you want to talk about non-extractive finance, is always through revolving loan funds, and always with the wealth that's generated through the productive labor of those who have borrowed should go right back into those communities, so that what you're doing is growing the commons of capital. As I said before, it's exactly like a seed library. If you think about it, the way a seed library works, it's exactly the same way non-extractive lending should work. If you have a seed library, if you think about a seed library, you can think of it as like, what does it take to have a seed library? Well, you need a librarian, you need seeds. Someone comes in, and the person who comes in becomes a member of the seed library, and they borrow seeds. And you never give out all the seeds at once. You get not just the seeds, but you get information about how the seeds were grown, and you need that knowledge to help you be successful. When they plant the seeds, they do not return back the seeds they borrowed like you do in a book library. You actually grow the plants, and you save some seeds, and you return the seeds that you grew, and you always return more than you borrowed. And when you return them, you have to share back the knowledge with how you grew them as well, because the diversity of seed doesn't just come from the seed. It comes from the conditions they were grown in, the soil, the tending, the watering, whether you sang to the plants or not. All of those things are part of what creates the diversity of seed. So you return the seeds, and you always return more than you had, so you're growing the seed library through your participation in it. And as a member of the seed library, you're responsible for helping maintain and govern it. So there's knowledge sharing, there's seed sharing, there's increasing the commons of seed that's held in the library. And that's how non-extractive lending has to work. You just replace the word seed with capital, which is just a resource that we currently need. And what is capital in the end, right? It's just a degraded form of clean air, healthy soil, fresh water, and our time. So what we want to do is capture or liberate that capital that has been enclosed in the markets and concentrated in the hands of elites, and return them to communities so they can be sunk back into the soil, they can be used to clean up the air, they can be used to help us transition to healthy, life-affirming, life-sustaining economies. If you're an investor and you imagine to yourself, I want to invest in really good projects, and I think I can still get 8 or 10 or 15% return on my investment, then I'm sorry, you're actually extracting wealth from either land or labor, and most likely both, because all wealth is generated through the work of the living world. So making money off the ownership of money is an extraction of wealth from whether it's human labor or the microbial life in the soil.
I love that. And is there like this is kind of getting a little bit wonky, but is there like a rate of return for investors that, like 3%, where it's like, okay, that's decent, and like they can sort of, make a little bit of money, but it's not too extractive? Or I'm not sure how you approach that question.
I'll start and let Michelle jump in on, I think Buen Vivir is a really good example. You can speak to that. But just to say, I think transition is the process of navigating contradictions. So as we're attempting to grow our local loan funds, we are offering very small returns to friendly investors who are willing to take the risks and willing to separate themselves out from control over the projects, because these projects are all community and worker cooperatively run projects. But ultimately what you want is that the loan funds are growing off the productive labor of the projects themselves. And then the question of how we define returns is its own question. And there's been some really innovative projects such as the Buen Vivir Fund, which I'll let Michelle talk about. She knows a lot more details on that. Or other things you wanted to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to say, I think like the most important way to answer that question is it's about relationship, right? So this is all about really shifting the way that we relate to each other in the economy. Right now, so much is invisibilized in this economy, from the many people who are, breaking their backs and leaving their families to go and, whether it's produce the solar panels on massive, fields in China, or produce our food in factories, and we just buy it in the supermarkets. There's so much invisibilized. And what is most critical about this transition is that we begin to both visibilize and restore relationship amongst us at every point in what is currently like a chain of economic exchange, and must begin to shift to a much more reciprocal and responsive relationship between entities, and not just entities, but like organisms, people, soil, the living world around us. It has to be much more cyclical and reciprocal. And so I think that's like the most critical part of like one of the most exciting things about non-extractive finance is like, people need to actually understand, like people with wealth, people who are holding wealth that they can invest, have not, in my mind, it shouldn't just be an option. Like they have a real responsibility to return that wealth to the communities that's been extracted from. And yeah, we have to do that in some transitional way, right? There's lots of contradictions as to why certain people ended up with massive amounts of wealth that they now get to invest, quote unquote. And what I would say is like, really, let's shift the notion of risk and return and think about, the return really must be the well-being of the communities of like all of our peoples and place. Because when people are able to make the decisions about their economic, like about their labor, about the way they're using resources in the economy, they will make decisions that are in alignment with the long-term health of their bodies, of their families, and of those places. And so I think that's like the real return that investors are getting, and investors need to actually put their capital behind that kind of return. And yeah, in the process, I mean, I think we're all navigating this question that you're raising about, but really how much, like what is the return? And I think, the financial cooperative is one space where we're really excited to engage with these questions with investors in a collective way, so that's a great place to start. Yeah.
And maybe Buen Vivir Fund, to like give an example of like maybe some on the ground projects that your organization might invest in, or Just curious about that one.
Yeah, definitely. The Buen Vivir Fund, I think, is a great place to invest where, communities, especially in the global South, are identifying projects that they see as needed to be able to shift their energy systems or their waste systems or, education or whatnot. And, but that are really are projects that are rooted in then a whole host of values and principles that don't just include an economic return that is based in the rules of this economy, which we know in most cases are upside down. Like the rules of this economy support over extraction and over production and all kinds of things that we know can't be sustained if we believe that life should continue to exist for on the planet. So I think Buen Vivir Fund is a great place for investors to check out. Actually not just check out, but I think Buen Vivir is a great place to for folks to invest in and really transfer the decision making to the communities that know best where that capital should be put.
And who also define what the financial return from that they're willing to share. So they view it as a sharing back, not as an entitlement of the investor. And in the financial cooperative, one of the roles that the financial cooperative plays is the aggregation of investment, so that investors don't get to pick and choose projects and therefore have either equity or control or over the projects, but that the projects themselves are autonomous and self-governed. And then we aggregate. That both mitigates the risk, but also allows us to distribute the resources across communities as they need it. We're a part of supporting Cooperation Richmond, which is based here in Richmond, California, which is a project that supports the development of worker and community-owned cooperatives in Richmond, and also provides capital support through the revolving loan fund. We've supported a worker-owned cooperative bike shop, and there's worker-owned cooperative food sovereignty projects, there's community-owned grocery stores, there's factories, there's childcare services, there's a host of different projects around the country. There's clean energy and energy democracy projects. So there's a whole host of things, zero waste projects that are supported. And we're in a growing stage of sort of developing more and more projects and more loan funds. But on the investor side, I wanted to propose a little thought exercise. Imagine I had this idea of like, maybe we should create an online portal for socially responsible investors. But instead of having it be something where you get to pick the projects you want to work on, it starts with a values screen. So you click on all the things you care about, and we list, forest protection and climate and prison industrial, everything. And you click on all of them, and then it tells you where the socially responsible investment opportunities are. And I guarantee you, if you click on all the things we all care about, you come up with next to nothing, which forces a person who is interested in making a financial return as their priority to unclick the values they care about in order to get money. And that's really what we're talking about.
Right.
If your return, your rate of return is inversely proportional to your allegiance to values. If you claim to be socially responsible, because the difference has to be made up somewhere, and it's made up through pollution or poverty. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think can I just build on that for a second?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Yeah, and I think that what we really need to shift to, right, is where right now that stuff is totally invisibilized to the investor.
That's right.
The investor doesn't have to deal with the consequences of an investment that results in polluting the river that people then drink out of. And or get asthma from the smokestack, or any of these things. And what I think we need to increasingly aim towards is that the investor is actually right there alongside the folks that are developing that project and enduring the consequences of it, which hopefully then are much more likely to be in concert with the investors' like real values, which are about life and about well-being. So I think that's like one of the things that we're engaged in is working with folks in faith communities right now. For instance, the Unitarian Universalist congregations and others, to look at what are ways that, number one, they can, they've already passed resolutions to divest from fossil fuels and other investments that they feel are not in alignment with their values. But then let's actually transfer this capital into these this non-extractive way to projects like the ones Gopal was just talking about, right, where communities are developing projects that support a just transition. So institutions is one level in faith communities, but then there's also just individuals who are in part of those communities coming together in place-based ways to come together with social movement organizations that are helping to develop these oftentimes worker-owned cooperatives or other entities that are part of this transition. And I think that provides also a really exciting opportunity for us to build across this divide, so that investors, again, are like right there in that community, seeing what is actually the benefit, and also supporting in all the ways that they have for that project or initiative being successful. Because that's actually what we need. Like there's capital, but then there's also all kinds of like access that comes with holding money. And we need people to be willing to transfer access to those relationships and that knowledge and those resources as well. And
I love this. I could talk to the two of you for another hour. And I know that I want to be respectful of your time. So maybe in the last few minutes here, two questions. The first is, what do you need right now? And how can the listeners of Next Economy Now help you grow this next economy?
Well, there's a couple of initiatives that we'd love for folks to join and get involved in. I mean, if you're a philanthropic institution, there's something called Shake the Foundations, which is involved in ways that philanthropy can shift its investments towards non-extractive, and ultimately towards transitioning those resources to social movements who are leading this transition. So that's one called Shake the Foundations. The other is this Reinvest in Our Power. If you're part of a faith community, let us know. And we'd love to work with you to try to identify ways to shift your investments. And then, support the Our Power campaign and the Climate Justice Alliance. We feel like this is a critical space for communities to be coming together around the just transition. And we need people from all types of, like, who wear all different hats, to be part of this movement, and feel like the Climate Justice Alliance is a really important place to do that work.
Yeah, and I would add that, especially as we start to think about the reality of like how wealth was concentrated in control, particularly in the unique context of American capitalism, having like how you invest or how you move resources or who you support is one thing, but getting organized in support of Black liberation and indigenous sovereignty in the United States in particular is deeply, deeply critical for all folks, not just Black and indigenous folks. That we have to recognize that the wealth of this country was generated off of stolen land and stolen labor, and of Black and indigenous folks. So finding ways to get organized in your community to uplift the leadership of Black and Indigenous folks and other communities who are on the front lines of the extractive economy, to follow that leadership and to make transformations at the small scale of your community to the large scale of systems change. Those are the things that I would encourage.
And just a couple, definitely check out our website. We'd love for folks to download resources. We have a zine called From Banks and Tanks to Caring and Cooperation. It's a strategy framework for a just transition, which you can download for free. Also check out Soulfire's website. To Gopal's point, they just have released a map of projects led by Black, Indigenous, and other queer and POC folks. And I think this project of reparations is really essential. Like that's one tool to shift capital, but we actually need just direct reparations as well. And I think in this moment, our folks really understand how critical access to land is, and then of course capital. And so that's a really important way to engage with this. So Soulfire Farm has produced this map where you can connect with those kinds of projects and support them.
That's amazing. And that was actually my last question, is where can folks go to learn more? And the Movement Generation website. Do you want to throw out the address real quick for folks?
Yep, it's www.movementgeneration.org.
Great. Well, thank you both so much for joining. It's been a pleasure talking, and I'm really excited to deepen the collaboration and learn more what the two of you are up to, and the whole collective, the whole MG collective. So thanks for joining.
Great. Thanks, Brian.
Thank you.
Next Economy Now is a production of Lift Economy. Lift is an impact consulting firm whose mission is to create, model, and share a locally self-reliant economy that works for the benefit of all life. To listen to all our past episodes or to share your thoughts about the show with us, visit www.lifteconomy.com/podcast. That's LIFT economy.com/podcast. You can also subscribe to this podcast through iTunes, Overcast, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Please take a moment to rate us on iTunes. It's really very helpful in allowing these ideas to reach a wider audience. Once again, thanks for listening.